Are you in Adobe Connect now?
Yes.
Okay, you should be fine.
Oh, okay. So I can hang up the phone? Just use
No,
the
you should keep the phone on.
Oh. Okay.
I think she wanted to know if she could get audio.
Audio, yeah. You can try it, but if that doesn't, I think a few people have been able to, but I won't guarantee that it will work.
Okay. Okay,
It's
then we will try that again and see if it works. If it's not, then we will use the phone.
Yeah, sorry that we used to be able to do those, but...
Okay, yeah, it's new to us. And
pass out the sign-up sheet again. Okay, now that we're starting to record, I'm going to go back to the word game for a few more minutes.
Okay, thank you.
So again, I'll just take a few more minutes. The idea is this is how I would try to start a class is with a puzzle. So this is our word puzzle, and I'm hoping I can tell a few of you are participating because you're challenging me on rules.
We're just trying to figure out the rules so we can bend them. You know?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, we can protest them.
Yeah. Although one previous presenter pointed out that her philosophy was the game master always overrides anything. Kind of like the Supreme Court.
And we started with Keith agrees on it.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I put it on.
That's my fault.
The messier your sign-up sheet is, the more likely it is you actually did.
Yeah. Exactly. All right, so I'm going to switch out of this screen. So I would recommend you write down any words you found because we're going to talk about what you did find. All right, so welcome to Gamification and Word Puzzles. So actually, all right, what I want you to do is if you're on the phone and have access to the chat room, put the words you found into the chat room, and everyone here write them down.
He's still trying to look at my list.
I wish I had photographic memory.
It will not affect your final grade. We'll get points for participating. It's about trying and not doing. It's like reverse Jedi. Okay, about 30 more seconds. And so I hope when I switch, you'll see some things in the chat room. All right, so 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. So I'm going to talk about, let's see what showed up in the chat room, and we can... Okay, so we have Sell, Nosy, Jeer, oh, with a J. That's always impressive. And, all right, Near, Eeks, Sun, Gutsy.
Oh,
and
I give up.
Mercy. All right. You actually answered one of the questions I was going to have for you. So, in this room, did anyone find anything else? Mercy. Mess. Keg. Very important.
Yawn, all these things here. Sun, fry, soy.
Mm-hmm.
Hem.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. No.
H-E-E.
Hey.
C. Spelling out the letter C.
I think also we found out that our list together is much longer than it would have been individually.
Right.
We had to save the human species, but this game we should all do it together.
Right.
Okay, so actually here's some of what I found. Erie, Merc, Nos, and then I listed out because I always find like a foreign word or proper words, so I just listed them but didn't count them. And where's the not so sure? So I'm probably going to go back, but so one of the questions I have, and you can put this in the chat room or answer. So what tricks, if any, did people use to find longer words?
I look for consonant clusters.
Okay. Like what kind?
Like CL or CR or LY or something like that.
I tended to pick a letter and then circle it.
Oh,
And
okay.
sort of continue to extend around.
Oh, okay. Anything else? Well, what I try and do is, it's sort of the same idea. If I have a word, I try and see if I can extend it on either end. And I also look for favorite consonant clusters, like if I see if there's an S around, because that'll extend a lot of words, but also things like if I see ing, I can see if I can attach anything to it, things like that.
I look for vowels, too, to make sure there was a vowel that could go into the word.
Yeah, always important. So for this sort of class, I'd be talking about, things like word endings and phonotactic constraints, which sounds can you put together in English and which ones you can't. So I don't usually, if I see something like KP or something like that, I tend to think it's not as likely you're going to have a word in there, whereas like SL, I think I might have a word. Okay, so slang or jargon, I think a few of us use that. And actually, I was kind of glad, Linda, naughty words, like, would it occur to you to try and see, and I've seen some pretty kind of interesting words get accepted, just say, not in this puzzle, but other puzzles, so what might be a reason you might avoid slang or jargon or, quote, naughty words, if that's your inclination?
If I was playing with my mom.
Yeah, okay. It's a good reason. So your audience is important. Any other factors you might Well, I kind of did my first question was, what is it going to be accepted?
Mm-hmm.
So it was like there are things that are words, but the game might not accept it because the game relies on whatever dictionary it has. So that would get into basically how do you construct a dictionary, which is an important part of sociolinguistics because there's really, if you've taken any linguistics, you know that there's really no dictionary, not even the unabridged ones, can contain every word you use. So like in Boston, milkshakes are fraps. I'm not sure I'd find frap in the dictionary, even though it's a word. Or
I play another electronic game similar to this, and they have it constructed so you can't use any racial epithets or anything
oh, okay.
Anything that
Probably
would be
a good
like
rule.
worse than PG rated.
I had not. See, those are not the naughty words I tried to use. Taboos are kind of interesting. Yeah. So and then I remember Mom. This was back in the 60s, but they were playing Scrabble, and they had a fight on whether karma would count or not. But I think today probably people would count it. But back in the 60s, it was considered foreign. So this is the kind of thing where I'm hoping, if you do a puzzle, that you might start thinking about. Any other comments? I didn't see any comments on the chat room, but I have a problem seeing the chat room, which is unfortunate. Just to let you know, so I decided that our ruling dictionary, if we were going to be serious tournament, would be the Oxford English Dictionary, which is a lot. So there are actually words. I did not know that hame was a word. So this is part of me cheating because I was sitting at my desk and I had the OED and I put it in. It turns out it's it's part of a device to link two horses together.
What's merc?
Merc, short for mercenary.
Oh, so the shorthand of exception?
Yeah. And there is another word meaning for it, and I can't remember what it is, to be honest.
What's nos?
Nos is part of your nose. I think it's the tip.
Didn't know that.
Yeah, so that was just, this looks like it could be a word. So I'll see.
Right.
Sounds like Dr.
Just like you said, it works as far as English sound system.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And the other one that surprised me was SOS was in the OED.
I saw that.
So, it's like, I could take it.
Right, which I had with a question mark after it.
Exactly.
Might be cheating.
Yeah. So, we talk about word games, you also have to have this discussion on what are you going to consider. And I know that I played Scrabble and they had words like ave, which I consider foreign, in there.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to really know that dictionary back and forth.
So the way you have this game set up, you wouldn't have counted socks or Rex or Gus or any of those?
Yeah, most of them don't usually count proper nouns.
Okay.
Although you could change the rules, they are words.
So do you think it's best to have rules or just leave the rules out there and then discuss it so that it's back later?
I think if I were running this in class, I would not mention the rules. Because I think there are cultural assumptions, like most word games don't count proper nouns, most word games don't count, and then talk about, well, did you think about this, or did you find them and reject them, or, you rejected
and I rejected it.
What was that?
I did see Sony, but I didn't write it.
Right.
I think most, at least in Scrabble, is to keep people from sort of cheating, right? Like, I have a cousin, Jew.
Yeah, exactly.
Not a person or a name.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you did let in foreign words, today it's easier because you can probably just look it up on Google and see if it really shows up anywhere, but there's some words I wouldn't want to try and...
So is this a game that you would do, once and done, or is this something that you might repeat every once in a while with a class?
It depends on what... This one I might... Now that I'm hearing the discussions, I might repeat it. Like I might repeat it once to talk about the sound system and another time to talk about dictionary formation or something like that.
Mhm.
So there are a few that I kind of, or at least the images of the games I kind of brought back up.
So as a way to assess what they got, what they're learning, how they're developing over time, or?
Actually, I think we're starting to get into presentation, but this is sort of kind of to warm
Okay.
people up. So no problem. So, yeah, the idea is to kind of get you thinking about things in a different way, because there are a lot of linguistics is like folk linguistics, meaning we have a certain assumptions on how language works, but then when you scientifically study things, it's not how you think it works.
Mhm.
So that's part of when you're doing a linguistics class, especially sociolinguistics, which is kind of where does sociology and linguistics interact?
Mhm.
And so, for example, a lot of people assume, and this is just like every culture, well, number one, they assume slang is degraded language, and that, even back in the Roman Empire, they were complaining that people weren't speaking Latin as good as they used to. But really, it's not that the language is degrading, it's just changing. And so it's true that some things sort of get lost, but then other things come up. So kind of just sort of changing, but the way we interpret it as it's all going downhill. And if you don't speak whatever the educated form is, so if you speak African American vernacular English or Appalachian English or Cockney or whatever, oftentimes you're seen as, you may be seen as stupid or not thinking as coherently as you could be. And that, again, isn't necessarily the case. It's just the grammar is different. Some of the styles are different. And this came up, a lot of people, when they're talking about the Trayvon Martin case, a lot of people were wondering if the fact that his friend was not using standard English impacted the jury, and it probably did, but how much, And that's always an interesting discussion, because then she kind of was saying things where I was sort of thinking, well, I really wish she hadn't said that. So that's the kind of things we get into. So, as you're seeing, we have these goals like talking about how our different dialects form different jargons. How do we use language in different contexts? So a formal presentation versus actually playing the game and eating pizza and switching back, and linguistic reality versus social reality. So when we talk about English dialects, we assume that everyone can sort of more or less understand each other. So Americans understand someone from Australia or Britain or most other places. But in China, when they talk about dialects, they're so far apart that linguists actually say they're really languages and they don't necessarily understand each other. But still, if you ask someone from Shanghai, do you speak Chinese? They'll say, oh, of course we do. But the kind of Chinese we speak at home is different from what we've taught in school. So you have to kind of talk about that. And multilingual policies. And the covert goals is, can we help, it's sort of like if you know about Sam Richard's sociology class, relating your life experience to, in his case, sociological principles, in my case, sociolinguistic principles. So, when you hear an African-American sports celebrity speaking, what assumptions are you making? And it may vary, not all African-Americans speak the same, so you might get different reactions depending on which speech style is being used. And how do you, understand people from other backgrounds? Because Central Pennsylvania, it is what it is. And, how do you approach non-English text with less fear and more curiosity and puzzlement? Or not puzzlement, analysis maybe. So I recently figured out from going to the Indian restaurant after how many years at MURG, M-U-R-G, is chicken. Like, oh yeah, all the chicken dishes have MURG in the title. Might be chicken. And then discussing hot topics. Whenever you talk about race, you're going to have a hot topic. So that's my little game icon, which I have to figure out how to good use for. That's the hot topic bomb. So kind of to get around it, and also because sociolinguistics, well, at first I want to talk about gaming versus gamification. So I think a lot of people here know, but the idea is there's gaming, which is you use games or game-like objects like puzzles or simulations within a course to get at certain learning objectives, but there's also gamification, which is you take traditional elements into a course and sort of put them into a game-like system, like you can earn points and achieve levels instead of just completing assignments, or you might earn additional rewards for going through things other than just getting your grade. And some courses have leaderboards, and, you know, we've also been talking about badges recently and what that might mean. So the last time I got to teach, I thought, oh, let me see if I can try some of these. So one of these I did was participation points, which is rewarding students for different types of participation. So all of you would have gotten points, especially if you contributed words.
So how did you find collecting that data?
Actually, I had a system for that.
Okay.
Going to go in the next
Okay,
slides, and then the puzzle du jour.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. He's participating. And then the puzzle du jour, which we just saw. So the participation point was, you know, traditionally I just said, all right, participation was worth 10% of the grade, and it was like, well, if you showed up and you talked a lot, you got the full part of it, and, you know, if you're one of those students who only showed up half the time, you got half the points, but there was really nothing quantified about what you could or couldn't do. So I started adding these things like if you turned your homework on time, you got a point. If you showed up to class, you got a point. Hey. If you actually talked in class, you got more points, and bringing up non-English examples was more, and writing an extra blog post is more, and writing a comment was worth points.
I assume they had to be relevant to the topics.
Although there's a lot of leeway.
So is the idea here, Elizabeth, that they had to do all of these things to get that 10%, or did it just give them some choice in terms of like
it sort of gave them choice, and then the next thing was levels. So basically it was, depending on your level, I think it was if you got to 96 points, you got your full 10%.
How did you come up with that number?
It was interesting. I kind of had it too low, and I had to bump it up in spring break. So it was based on kind of if you just turned your homework in on time and you participated in class, you got a certain number of points per week, and then you added them up. Like, it was 13 weeks worth was sort of where you would end up. And then they asked me, well, if I got 95 points, does that mean you don't get the full 10%? And I said, well, you know, there's a wiggle room. But this would guarantee. But yeah.
So it's partly the idea of like you earn your way toward this rather than like a set of assignments, and if you complete them, you're good. It's more like you can contribute in different ways to earn this category of things.
Right, and then so like if you got to 24 points, you could skip an extra class without me hassling about it. You got to 48 points. Normally, if you were late, you lost 3 points, but I would forgive one of your late assignments. 72, I would then take your lowest homework and add 3 points. Although it should have probably been second lowest homework, because you also got to drop a homework. So I had to. There were a few tweaks I needed to make. 144 was, you know, normally you could drop your lowest homework. If you got to 144, you could drop your lowest too.
No, they used the 48 points if they turned in an assignment late. Did they go back to 0 and start over, or was it cumulative?
They had to redeem points, so yeah, they would. And what I said was you should wait till the end of the semester and redeem then. You figure out which one you really wanted to do.
So how did you keep track of this? Did you have like a spreadsheet or?
Yeah, I actually had a spreadsheet, and that turned out actually talked about what worked. One was that I actually took attendance, which I sort of had informally taken attendance, but I actually tracked who was there, who wasn't there. And I tried to give an update every week of how many points they got. And I think some of the people, they were like, all right, I wanted to make sure that she counted my attendance, so it did work there. I surveyed the students to see what their reaction was. I would say they were sort of intrigued, so they did feel like it encouraged them to speak, and they were sort of saying, well, it encouraged me to attend, and definitely encouraged me to submit the homework on time. They definitely wanted to redeem points, and they seemed to like them. They didn't want it without the points. They wanted to keep the points. What needed tweaking? I feel like I needed a bigger variety of qualifying actions. Like I didn't count participating in the morning puzzle per se, but I think I would now, like, try and give an answer as opposed to just sitting there. Like I said, I had to adjust the point value, which was not popular, but you don't want to let your students get to full credit by spring break. Then they'll stop coming. And then there was some discussion about rewards. Now, the top reward request was to skip a class.
So they don't actually still want to come
to class. I've been looking for alternatives to that one because that's sort of, it could be that maybe we can make it that if enough students get to a certain percentage, then we can cancel class. But it would have to, if 75% of the students.
Yeah, but they should want to go there enough that canceling class shouldn't be.
Yeah, I know. Should be a punishment.
I mean, that kind of gets to the point of gamification, and one of the issues that people have with it is this extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation. And so it's kind of like, oh, okay, well, I can get this, this, and this if I do it, and that's why I'm going to do it, rather than I'm really interested in, what's going on, the learning that I'm doing. Hey, I'm paying for this, so, you know what I mean? I just wonder if anybody else has thought.
Well, I mean, they're still driven by how many points did I get on this paper?
Yeah. I think other people can have different philosophy. My philosophy has been, I can try and feed intrinsic motivation, so I can try and make my classes more, relevant, make my presentations more effective, introduce more active learning and quirkiness. But, I've also, if a student doesn't want to be in phonetics class, they're just taking it because they have to and they really hate it, there's not much I can do.
Right.
No, so I like the idea of the point system. It may just be that the ability to skip class probably isn't a good reward to put in there.
Yeah,
I undermine the.
Yeah, I wouldn't do it for individuals. I might think about it for the whole class.
Well, what was your view as the instructor of this course? You've been teaching this course for a while, right? In putting these rewards out there, did you feel like people were elevating their level of participation of discourse in class, even if there were some opt-out rewards, or do you feel like they just sort of min-maxed it to do as little as they could?
Well, I think you have to structure your rewards for what counts.
Right.
And, you want higher quality things to count more.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, which is my next problem, is the shy student paradox, which is I think a lot of students perceive that the quickest way to get rewards is to talk in class, and I definitely encouraged it, but they're just students, they're thinking about it, and they turn in really good homework assignments, and they just hate talking. And in one case, there was one student who just hated the whole thing. But I think he was someone who was into linguistics for the computational stuff, and the sociolinguistics stuff, I think, was stuff he wasn't interested in. So he just stopped coming to class, and after a while, I just stopped telling him what his points were.
Right.
He was completely, not having any. But then there are other students who are interested, but they just aren't, they're just really very shy.
That could sometimes be a cultural thing, too, with different international students. It might come from a culture where you just don't talk in class or debate in class.
And I think sometimes it's, I hate to say it, it's gender, too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a lot of American women, I see this pattern. And I've seen a few. There was one guy who was pretty bright, but kind of his persona was sort of the frat boy persona. He was actually, when I could get him to give answers, he would give interesting answers. So then I'm sort of thinking I need to find more ways that they can participate online. I think there are also people who just like, and I'm one of these that I prefer writing sometimes because I can actually think and edit myself, and if I speak spontaneously, I don't always make sense. So, I was thinking, I did give reward points for extra blog entries, and a few people took it, but not as many as I could have. Sharing best answers, so we had weekly blog assignments, and they were all together, so, maybe doing the voting thing. And you get points for voting, you get, additional points for winning. So, for example, one of the assignments I always do is if you discover your fudge is missing from the communal refrigerator, how do you approach finding out who the culprit is and what would be the best solution? So you can 2 points for that.
So can I clarify, the blog was for everybody, like it wasn't an individual person's blog, it was a class blog?
Right. So
I essentially post kind of a homework answer in some sense of responding to these proposed questions.
So, I have blog assignments, so I would propose a question like, your fudge is missing, what do you do? And then students would submit comments as their answers.
So what was the best one?
Well, you usually get varied answers sometimes, and this time I asked them to do 2 scenarios, so it was like their roommate, they might just go for the direct who took my fudge. And then if it was not appropriate, you might, I think the best one I heard was they might talk really long about, this fudge is made by my grandmother, and it reminds me of home, and she sent it all the way from Indiana, and she can't make it as much as she used to anymore. I go on and on and on, and I'm so sad now. So, I think that was one of my favorites, I have to confess, but there have been a number of.
So, you had them accumulating points. I was wondering if there were any thoughts on starting with like 100 and then or 1,000 or whatever, and then going backwards.
I think in this case I wouldn't want to go backwards.
Subtracting points is kind of punishing, so that might turn students off.
I think, I think in terms of the whole, like you have 1,000 points for the course and then you lose them.
It would be like, take care of your grades.
Yeah. I haven't tried that. I've heard pluses and minuses on that one.
When I was a classroom teacher, I did participation points a couple of years. And I had to stop doing it because I found myself so sucked into that I felt like I couldn't even do the rest of it. You know what I mean? So that's one of the reasons why I was asking about like how you kept track of it. It seems like this is a pretty manual process. It seems like if there was a system that could automatically pick up a lot of this, it would free you up to teach and then be more useful for someone like me. Because I was like, I can't do this again.
Well, some of it, like, you can track you can track who turns in homework and blog. Some of it you can do automatically. And if you have clickers, you might be able to do other things, like if they answered so many clicker questions, that would add 2 points. My class is never really big enough that I can get a good clicker set up, but
what's the average attendance, or your average enrollment? How big is the class?
It's like usually 12 to 14.
That's manageable.
So that's the other reason I can actually,
Yeah, that's like 150. I mean,
if I had
you know what I mean?
150.
There were 30 times 5 or 6 classes, you know. You're talking 150 is 200 people. It's like, oh my
Yeah, I
gosh,
would definitely have to rethink.
Yeah.
How to do
You'd have to go with like the honor system of they track their own.
Well, that's, you know, clickers, like, I would
Yeah.
probably reformulate some of my, what I'm going to show as puzzles as clicker questions, and then if you do so many clicker questions, then you get...
But you still had to do a translation of the points into your grade book, right?
Yeah.
So that was still, even though it might pick up some of the data, you still had to manually interpret that, correct?
I just created a second spreadsheet and just threw in points, and I did find that I had to make sure I did it pretty soon after the class ended.
Right.
So one of the things was, you know, but at that size I could sort of remember who did what. And I did kind of get a little sloppy after a while, I have to confess. So, like, if I couldn't remember if they were there or not, I would give it to them.
Right.
But it does seem, I mean, it's interesting because it seems like the way that you assign points really had, you know, we were just talking about participation, but to me that's partly about either an in-class dynamic or a kind of intellectual contribution on a blog that can then be rolled back into class and be a viewpoint of discussion, versus to me homework can be kind of individual and separate, or, I mean, coming to class is important, but like, I'm thinking about that, you know, where you say, even though they write excellent homework answers, some people just don't like to talk, and so, you know, I think that issue of, I mean, most of our students are pretty good about written homework because they know that sort of leaves a trace and is very measurable, and that you have a book where you check that off, whereas again, the in-class participation is a fraught issue because it's much harder to quantify or especially if you have a larger class. So I was wondering about, you know, would it be possible to not collapse those categories, you know what I mean, like to have, you know, to say what you consider participation, because doing homework may or may not be a participatory activity. You know what I mean, like if the homework's on a blog and then the whole class can see it, then that to me is a form of community engagement that constitutes participation in the class. But if it's paper that just comes to me.
Well, that's why I gave it a relatively low point, but it sort of also, to me, was a sign that you were engaged enough to keep up with it, I think was sort of my thinking on that. And the blog assignment, so again, so the homework, some of it was individual, and some of it was the communal blog. So, like, if it was something where everyone could have the same range of answers, that was individual. But if it was a lot of people could come up with different answers, that tended to be a blog.
Just because, I mean, one of the ways I force my students to talk is either by leveraging their homework answers, because I've seen them, and I'm like, you got to tell us about what you wrote, because it's good.
Yeah, that's a good way.
And I know you've already articulated it, because I've seen it. You know what I mean? I'm going to make you say it, essentially, in class. Or by making actually some of the homework be a participation in the sense of your computational linguist, like having to bring in an angle of computational linguistics that's used in sociolinguistics.
Yeah.
Because sociolinguistics also counts things, you know, so that like, because I don't like to have a student who basically is kind of physically present but essentially a non-entity, because they, set up a blockade against the material.
Well, I was also wondering, like, the system that you set up was very, you know, teacher-directed. Is there a way that you could come in with a template and then have students give their perspective on what is valuable and what isn't valuable?
I think I did try, and I asked in the survey what they thought were, you know, what rewards they wanted and how they wanted points. I think what might make sense is to kind of run it through the first few weeks and then sort of have a discussion on what's working, not working, probably a more communal discussion could make sense. But I think the other thing about it, they kind of, like I said, it's sort of, when I just sort of did traditional 10%, it's like, well, just talk in class or do whatever. And I think this sort of is an opportunity to say exactly what I'm looking for.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind for me is if they're involved in setting this up, then you also get to see what their goals are in taking the course, you know, which I think might help to inform you in how to present the material or how to hook them, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I've never done it that way,
Yeah.
so I just wanted to think about
Yeah, it's something worth thinking about.
Did you find that they were just chasing points, or were they actually making constructive comments? What did you think?
I think what I was trying to do was constructive, so even if they were chasing points, it was actually constructive.
Mm.
So yes, actually most of the comments they gave were pretty constructive.
And I could also see something like, and I know, you know, there have been a lot of comments about gamification systems that, oh man, you know, systems that will,
Yeah.
that will overlay on top. I mean, I think, you know, speaking of student engagement involvement, having a system like that allows them to become a part of the assessment, you know, so if they feel that somebody put a blog that was really good and they get to assess it, you know, then it becomes more like a community of, you know, that are involved in that whole system.
Yeah, and I think I would definitely have, like, I think the voting for the blog sort of would contribute to that.
Mm-hmm.
I did kind of want to go through the few puzzles, just sort of, you sort of already saw what, the idea was just kind of to wake up your brain and see, and I wanted to distinguish what was puzzles versus just practice, because I also used to just, you know, run a lot of practice activities in class. So what I was trying to do is be more entertaining, basically. So trying to kind of look for cool graphics and videos. There's some quirkiness. So in general, so like the Real Housewives of New Jersey have come up from time to time. And it's also, I find, like, the puzzles are sometimes an interesting way of introducing trivia, because if you can figure it out, you kind of, at least I tend to remember it. And then they were lower stakes, so they didn't necessarily show up as homework exercises. So just in addition to what you saw earlier, so this is one I used where the idea was to figure out which languages are on here. This is from London.
Mm-hmm.
And actually the one, if anyone knows this last one in the Arabic script, I'm pretty sure it's not Arabic.
Mm.
But if they happen to know what it really is. So anyone, some of them should be hopefully familiar. So anyone...
English?
You have English, yeah. Thank goodness.
Hindi? Is it Hindi up there?
Yeah, Hindi's up there. Yes. What was that? German, yep. Italian, Spanish.
It must be French.
You know, I'm not sure there is. Oh yeah, the second one. Yeah.
What are the third and the fourth on the right? What are those?
Okay, there's the Dahani. I think that I have to look what. You know, I'm gonna have
one
to.
Of those is probably Hindi, right?
Yeah, the third one is Hindi. This is Chinese. This is Punjabi.
Punjabi, okay.
This
Is that Hungarian? No.
No, this is Slovak
Mm.
and Turkish.
Mm.
So I can't actually pronounce it, but I know what the writing system looks like. This is French, German, Italian, Spanish, Dutch. This is Welsh, which I wasn't expecting anyone to get. And this one surprised me, Albanian. So I'm wondering...
What was the bottom one on the right?
I don't know.
Oh, you didn't get that one.
I'm pretty sure it's not Arabic because they've got too many vowel letters on there. It could be, my guesses are Persian or Urdu.
Okay.
So
That's cool.
Through Google Translator.
Yeah, I don't know how I could write it.
And then you have a symbol.
Pick a picture.
What was that?
What's the symbol, right?
Oh, yeah. It's like it's a logogram. So yeah. Yeah.
Well, your sign gets too long and people stop paying attention.
So, and I sort of did a similar one. We won't go through this one, except this one is in LA. And so it has like Vietnamese and Tagalog. And then it's got, I think, 2 types of Chinese, and I think that's Hindi again. And a really funky form of Korean. Which I don't.
Right, it's Japanese.
Oh, okay. Yeah. But the fonts they were using were strange. And then this is the New York version, so. And just a reminder that when you have lots of languages, you sort of have to kind of do that. And there is linguists don't want to admit if there is a bureaucratic cost to that. What does that mean? And then another one. So, obviously English has the most pages, but any guesses on what language number 2 is? Any other guesses?
I'd say the Aztec, right?
Yeah, that's not number 2.
Chinese?
Yeah, any other guesses?
I guess none of our guesses were correct.
I'm trying to get better about, yeah, that's a good guess. But actually, surprisingly, I think it's Dutch.
Wow.
So, and it's not numbers of speakers, it's who's kind of culturally invested. The other interesting thing I found out was English has the largest number of editors by far, and like when you get down to like Dutch, it's like 20 or 50 editors. So it's like there's this cadre of people.
Prolific writer.
Yeah. And there are like over 500 languages in there. So. And this is when I throw it. So this is, anyone want to guess what? And I'm going to say, just try and imagine the speaker has a Jamaican accent.
What are we guessing?
So actually, I'll give you a hint. It's just the Jamaican New Testament.
No, I mean, what do you want us to guess?
So the second line, anyone?
Good news about Jesus.
Yeah. And that Jesus balls, so what would the English, what's B-A-A-L, how would you spell it in standard English?
B-A-W-L.
Yeah. They're saying Jesus bald. And the second one, it's an Old Testament book. Anyone? Yes, the Book of Ruth. And then?
Answer?
Yeah.
Save?
Yeah. Yeah. Nobody forced me abandon you.
I guess you have to say it out loud. It works better.
Yeah.
Yeah. What was that game that you do that? They have it like phonetically, so you have to figure out what they're saying. That's kind of what it is.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anywhere you live. Okay.
Yeah. So I think I can sort of see the idea actually, and I just want to point out that not all Jamaicans speak like this. So they're actually, if you talk about it, this is sort of kind of the most distant from standard English, and in the Jamaican, there's been a movement in Jamaica basically to standardize this particularly far form from standard English, because so many people speak it that it impacts their education. So if you speak a language that's really far from English, when you go to school, you're basically having to almost learn a second language. Not everyone, even in Jamaica, not everyone recognizes this as a serious linguistic issue. So a lot of people, even in Jamaica, sort of kind of giggled when they heard that they were translating the Bible into this particular language, and it's because partly it has things like Jesus bald. But, it's, given enough time, this could actually be considered, elevated classical Jamaican or something like that. It's just, we're not there yet, but this has been an interesting attempt where they're standardizing a Creole, which in Creoles have really bad reputations. Everyone thinks they're sloppy and no good, and only illiterate people speak them. But in reality, they are full languages, and there is a lot of, cultural contributions. It's just not the same way that happens in standard English. And then we also get into discussions on, is this a separate language? Is it, how comprehensible is it? If we change the spelling, would that make a difference?
Right.
Probably would make some difference, but then it would be so far from what it is phonetically.
Right. Who would the scholars of the language be, right?
Right. And that's sort of, again, what has normally happened is there are people who grew up in Jamaica who got linguistics degrees, or in some cases people who are interested in the situation and want to contribute. And that can be political too. So like Native American preservations, a lot of white people are involved in that. And sometimes they screwed some things up culturally.
Right.
So that's sort of that exercise. And students really responded to this better, which kind of surprised me because they did you were a lot more active than most of my students were. So I have to kind of work on that. But they definitely agreed that it helped them understand concepts and they were fun. And they would prefer that there be puzzles in the class, and they would like even more, which I would agree with.
So then you think about the link between memory and learning and the fun aspect, like...
Yeah.
I'm sure there's a lot of studies out there, but...
Yeah.
You remember things that are more fun.
Right? Yeah, they're more fun. And also just, it's one thing to kind of hand out a passage, but to actually work through it.
So what do you think it was? It seems like overall these scores are a little bit higher than the game scores themselves. What do you think was the big differentiator there? For the puzzles versus the initial... the participation points? Yeah.
Well, I think participation points, sort of what they're saying, sometimes it's just an overlay. So basically, you're doing the same thing you would do, but, there's kind of, you're getting tracked for it. So there's a little more fun, but, it's still, you're still having to show up for class, which they didn't want to do. Whereas this, I think, really does it is a little more intrinsically fun. So, you're looking at pictures and you're looking at weird scripts, or you're trying to read something in another language. And so I think it's more interesting. I tried to make it kind of relevant to both what's going on in the class and sometimes what's going on now. But also, I think I'm finding it's a good way. They're kind of walking into certain skills that are important.
How much extra time did it take you to prepare all of this type of material in addition to teaching the lecture and things like that?
I would say, it was, I had to think about it, so it would be another hour, but I think once you do it the first semester, you probably have a good bank. And I'm finding I really appreciated what it did for me as an instructor, because now I'm sort of thinking, all right, how can I, whereas before I think I was so used to, I would just lecture about it. Now I'm much more, no matter what I'm doing, I'm more likely, all right, let's throw this out as a puzzle and have people sort of talk about it.
I'm kind of thinking about that question, what do you replace? You know what I mean? Like, because you have more interaction, it seems like a better activity for learning for everyone, you know what I mean? Versus a lecture where you're just pretty much regurgitating information and feedback.
I think, to me, you are losing lecture time, but I think I found that you gained some of what I would have said in lecture. We kind of had already talked about in the puzzle.
Right.
So I would just say, all right, well, we talked about it in the puzzle.
Right.
So, before I might say, all right, well, London, they have to have a sign with all these different languages. Well, you've already seen the sign with all these crazy languages on there. Right. So that's giving them a real connection to what the situation is without me just throwing a bunch of random statistics at them. So I can just say, and then London, you have like all these people. Oh, yeah. So I think you end up gaining more, and it's sort of, I think, hard, because I was very much, traditional lecture type mode, but I am realizing that even though it looks like you're losing time, you're actually gaining, especially in the higher order things that you really want them to gain. I don't really need them to know how many languages are in London. I need them to understand that there are an amazing number of languages floating around in these major cities and what it means, partly from a policy. So, tweaking, I find, like, in the beginning, my puzzles tended to be a little too hard. So, like this sign puzzle, would know, but maybe after a while I would give this one is from a Southeast Asian, and they had a war there in the 60s or something like that. And the idea was that. So I think we're just about out of time, but if there, the question, am I innovating or skinning, and hopefully I'm innovating a little bit. But
yeah, you were talking about starting the class with it, maybe. That's a good thing, but maybe thinking about it in terms of moving it around.
Yeah.
So if there's a natural point where you would talk about England instead of lecturing about it, stick the puzzles there, introduce that topic.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of the idea. Is I think I started doing that was like it wasn't just one puzzle per day. It would be like more, but like the one in the day I think was sort of the keystone one.
You could even start the class on like the most incredible blog that any student had for the week, and then that engages them and gives them a feel of, okay, this is my class.
Yeah.
And then, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That it's still a cushion, maybe a leg cushion, but you're still,
Yeah, that's another way.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Students also really like making those things up. So if there's any way to assign topics in advance to any team of people, my students like to make up games for each other. They love to give out candy bar prizes. But anyway, that's fine with me.
Yeah.
Let's come with a game and a bag of candy. It's French. We all love to eat. That's really why people say. Because anyway, and also in terms of the instructional time, my students, if a group of them is investing an hour and a half in a rotating fashion versus me an hour and a half every time, and I sometimes that's too not creative. So anyway, I don't know. I feel like also that idea of like modeling a couple of these things, and then maybe picking some people and saying, I want you to base a game off the readings that we have for Thursday, for next Thursday. And see how they do with it.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing I was doing was giving them like sort of scavenger hunt quests, like pick a language and find someone who's doing disco music in that language and on YouTube, and someone doing like traditional music, and that might be something where you could have that might be where you have the one guy managed to find Gaulish and heavy metal.
Gaulish.
Yeah. So. Like, I don't know how authentic that is, but yeah, it's interesting.
I still can't understand.
Fortunately, it's heavy metal. It's universal. So, yeah, any other thoughts? I mean, I think I had some really good comments, which is definitely one of the reasons I wanted to talk about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thanks so much for doing this.
Thanks.
This was great.
And just my ad, October 2nd, if you've been keeping up with the STEM badges, Kyle Tech will have an update, and now they're do-it-yourself badges.
So that's the next talk.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Cool. That was really good.
And there's leftover pizza and Pepsi. All right, well, thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you. Across the Great Divide there, I'm going to... I didn't see anything in the chat, but if you have any questions, please send them to gaming@su.edu.
So will you tell me how that feature works, like if you want to have people sending in like they did their word combos, like how did they send that to your PowerPoint?
It's going to take me a month over.
Oh, actually, there's it's from, I played it on my iPad, and there's I think it's the power button and the. There's two buttons you press and it takes a screen capture, and then you can email it to yourself.
Technological snafus.
Yeah.
But is there a way, is that happening in real time?
That's awesome.
Like,
you
like in class, could your students, this was the Adobe Connect chat, is that right?
Yeah, I could do it in Adobe Connect, but
So
yeah.
that was in the Adobe, that's
But
Adobe
you could
Connect.
do it, if you had an iPad, you can get a dongle. It's got to be, I think, at least a Gen 2 iPad. But yeah, there's a dongle you can plug it in like your Mac to your projector.
And then display what's there.
Okay, I did the application and
Sure.
I kind of, like,
Yeah.
I idea of that,
99% sure everything.
my concerns aren't necessarily big enough.
You got the funding, so that's
For clickers, but if you can use our phones, obviously
This
that's,
year's.
Yeah.
or can clickers work through the phone now, I don't know.
I don't know, but there's I know some people use Pull Everywhere.
Oh, right, yeah.
So also works, but
I can't wait to see what it looks like.
yeah, with French class, I can see you can come up with sort of a whole bunch of
All right, well, I'll see you.
similar activities.
I mean, we
It's
do,
like-
we do get, but also, even for graduate classes, because I have a tendency to kind of cheat in a way with grad classes and be like, we don't need to have fun because it's a graduate class.
Yeah.
They're serious. But I think even, there's room for a variety of activities, and I think,
Yeah.
when you're, like you said, when you're kind of trying to, kind of like Sam Richards does, or like trying to switch people into looking at the world that's already around them, but through a new lens, like using everyday things, whether it's, games built on everyday things, seems like it helps train them on what you mean by that,
Yeah.